What if you came home to find your mother involved in an unthinkable betrayal? Not with one of your sons, but with both of them. A betrayal so unimaginable it shattered the foundation of a family forever. It all began with a seemingly innocent arrangement. Two teenage brothers, Ethan and Caleb, were sent to spend 2 weeks with their grandmother Helen, while their parents traveled for work. It was a simple plan, a chance for the boys to reconnect with their grandmother and for Helen to enjoy some company in her otherwise quiet home. Helen, now in her late 60s, was once the cornerstone of her family. A retired school principal, she had lived her life with discipline and integrity. But since the passing of her husband, the lively home she had built had become a place of silence and reflection. The days stretched long, and the nights weighed heavily on her. Ethan and Caleb, 17-year-old twins, were strikingly confident and bold. Their energy was infectious, their charm undeniable. They had grown into young men in every sense, self-assured and unapologetically carefree. When they arrived at Helen's home, their presence brought a spark of life to the stillness, and for a moment, she felt a sense of purpose again. At first, everything felt as it should. They shared meals, played games, and talked late into the night about their future plans. But as the days passed, small moments of discomfort began to creep in. The boys had a way of taking up space, lounging around the house in ways that felt overly familiar, their confidence sometimes bordering on arrogance. Helen told herself it was harmless, just teenage bravado, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling growing in her chest. But something about their presence was different. These were no longer the young boys she had once cared for. They were men now, and their confidence unnerved her in ways she couldn't fully understand. What Helen didn't know was that this visit would become a turning point, unraveling the ties that bound her family together and leaving scars that would never heal. This was the beginning of a nightmare. What started as a quiet family visit quickly took an unsettling turn. At first, everything seemed normal. Ethan and Caleb were lively and full of energy, bringing life into Helen's quiet home. They joked around, helped her in the kitchen, and filled the house with laughter that hadn't echoed through its walls in years. For Helen, it was a welcome change, something to break the monotony of her loneliness. But as the days passed, subtle shifts began to emerge. Helen first noticed it in the boys' demeanor. Their confidence, initially refreshing, began to feel intrusive. They moved through her home as though it were their own, lounging on the couch or walking around shirtless after workouts. Their casual disregard for boundaries unsettled Helen, though she told herself it was harmless, just youthful bravado. Still, the way they filled every corner of the house made her feel strangely out of place. At dinner one evening, Caleb made a teasing remark about how young Helen still looked for her age. The words themselves were innocent enough, but his smirk lingered, and his gaze felt too deliberate. Helen forced a laugh, brushing it off as a playful comment, but a seed of unease was planted. Things escalated as Ethan began to mirror Caleb's behavior. Together, the twins seemed to thrive on pushing boundaries. They would wrestle loudly in the living room, their voices filling the house with an energy that felt less playful and more imposing. Helen tried to ignore it, but there was a deliberateness to their actions, a sense that they were testing her reactions. One afternoon, Helen walked into the living room to find Ethan sprawled across the couch, shirtless, scrolling through his phone.
"Ethan, put on a shirt,"
she said firmly, trying to reassert her authority. He looked up with a casual grin.
"Why? It's just us, Grandma. Relax."
Helen's heart skipped a beat. There was no malice in his tone, but the dismissiveness, the subtle challenge to her authority, felt jarring. She hesitated before retreating to the kitchen, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. That evening, they were watching a movie together. As the credits rolled, Caleb leaned over to reach for the popcorn bowl, his hand brushing Helen's arm. The touch lingered, his fingers grazing hers just a moment too long. When she glanced at him, she caught an expression that wasn't playful or innocent. It was something else entirely. Helen froze. She told herself she was overreacting, but the way Caleb smirked as he settled back into the couch left her questioning everything. From that moment, the atmosphere in the house shifted. The twins became bolder. Caleb, the more confident of the two, seemed to lead, while Ethan followed. They brushed past Helen in the hallway, their touches lingering. Their compliments became pointed, their gazes more lingering. What once seemed like harmless confidence now felt deliberate and unsettling. One morning, Helen found herself alone in the kitchen with Ethan. He was helping her with breakfast, something he'd done before, but this time his proximity felt overwhelming. As she reached for a plate, he stepped closer.
You're amazing, Grandma.
He said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how you do it all. The words were innocent enough, but the intensity in his tone wasn't. Helen felt her pulse quicken. She laughed nervously, brushing him off, but the moment lingered in her mind long after he walked away. Later that day, Caleb made a similar comment about how lucky Helen was to have two strong grandsons to help her around the house. His tone was teasing, but his gaze lingered a moment too long. Helen's cheeks flushed with shame, but she couldn't pinpoint why. Deep down, she knew the dynamic was shifting in ways she didn't understand. By now, Helen could no longer deny the truth. The boys weren't just pushing boundaries, they were breaking them. And she, in her vulnerability, didn't know how to respond. Every interaction felt charged, tinged with an unspoken tension she couldn't escape. Helen began avoiding being alone with them whenever she could, retreating to her room and locking the door at night. But even in the safety of her own space, her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't quiet. How had things come to this? How had a simple family visit turned into something so twisted? She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The lines between right and wrong were already blurring, and the choices she would make in the days to come would unravel everything she thought she knew about herself and her family. The nightmare had only just begun. It happened one quiet evening. The house was unusually still, the air thick with unspoken tension. Helen was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Caleb walked in, his presence commanding in a way that felt out of place.
Need help with that?
He asked, his voice soft but tinged with something that made Helen's pulse quicken. Before she could answer, he stepped closer, reaching for a dish towel. His hand brushed against hers, lingering a moment too long. It wasn't a grandson's casual gesture. It was deliberate, unmistakable. Helen froze, her breath catching in her throat. She wanted to pull away but didn't. The years of isolation, the aching loneliness she had buried, left her vulnerable in ways she hadn't acknowledged until now. Caleb leaned in slightly, his voice low.
You deserve to feel special, Grandma. You don't have to be alone.
Helen wanted to scream, to push him away, to reassert her authority. But she couldn't. That small crack in her resolve widened, and she let her guard down. Ethan joined shortly after, his approach quieter but equally unsettling. He entered the room, his gaze flicking between Caleb and Helen with a knowing look. He didn't need to say anything. The tension in the room spoke volumes. Helen felt the weight of their stares and knew things had shifted irrevocably. In the days that followed, the boundaries between them disintegrated. The twins grew bolder, their advances losing any pretense of subtlety. Caleb, always the instigator, pushed limits with calculated confidence. Ethan, though less vocal, mirrored his brother's behavior, complicit in every moment. Together, they created a toxic power play that left Helen reeling. Helen's nights became a torment of shame and confusion. She lay awake, haunted by memories of her late husband Roger, his unwavering kindness, the life they had built together. She imagined his reaction to the woman she had become, the choices she had allowed to unravel their family's legacy. She hated herself for the vulnerability that had brought her to this point. The twins didn't allow her to retreat into her thoughts for long. They ensured she remained ensnared in their game, cornering her in the living room or brushing past her in the hallway, their touches deliberate and charged. Each interaction chipped away at Helen's sense of control, leaving her feeling more isolated than ever. One evening, Helen summoned the courage to confront Caleb alone in the den. Her voice trembled as she said,
This has to stop. It isn't right.
Caleb leaned back, his expression unshaken.
Why? No one's getting hurt, Grandma. We're all adults here.
The word stung. Helen realized with chilling clarity how deeply the dynamic had shifted. She no longer held authority. Caleb's confidence had erased the boundaries that once seemed unshakable. Desperate to reclaim control, Helen tried to re-establish boundaries, but the twins exploited her weaknesses with unrelenting precision. They knew her loneliness, her longing for connection, and used it against her. What began as subtle manipulation now felt like a relentless storm, leaving her powerless to resist. Helen stopped answering her daughter Rachel's calls. Every ring of the phone reminded her of the betrayal she couldn't bring herself to admit. The shame ran so deep that even hearing Rachel's voice felt unbearable. She avoided the outside world altogether, retreating further into the toxic spiral created by her grandsons. The twins, emboldened by her silence, behaved as though nothing was wrong. They laughed, joked, and moved through the house as if their actions carried no weight. But beneath their charm, there was a calculated intent to keep Helen isolated, ensuring she felt she had no escape. Helen's guilt consumed her. Each attempt to regain her footing only pulled her deeper into their grip. She hated the attention they gave her even as she craved it, her emotions a tangled mess of disgust and longing. She no longer recognized herself or the life she was living. One evening, as she prepared for bed, Helen caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, her face etched with guilt and despair. She whispered to herself,
"This isn't me."
But the truth was undeniable. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The affair had taken root, and Helen knew there was no escaping the consequences. The once strong bonds of her family had unraveled, replaced by a web of secrecy and destruction. The question wasn't if the truth would come out, but when and how devastating the fallout would be. Locked in this spiral, Helen, Caleb, and Ethan marched toward an inevitable tragedy. The nightmare had consumed them all, and there was no turning back. The truth often has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. For Rachel and David, returning home early from their trip was supposed to be a pleasant surprise for their sons and Rachel's mother, Helen. But what awaited them shattered their world. Their flight had landed ahead of schedule, and they decided to skip the usual courtesy of calling ahead, eager to enjoy the thrill of an unplanned homecoming. As they pulled into the driveway, the house seemed unusually quiet, too quiet. Rachel's chest tightened with unease. She glanced at David, who offered her a reassuring smile.
"They're probably watching a movie or asleep,"
he said lightly, but Rachel wasn't convinced. Stepping inside, Rachel called out,
"Mom, Ethan, Caleb, we're home."
No answer. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the living room. Something felt off. Rachel exchanged a wary glance with David before setting down her bags. Moving toward the kitchen, she saw signs of life, dishes in the sink, a jacket draped over a chair. But still, no one appeared. Then she heard it. Laughter, muffled, distant, and unmistakable. It was coming from upstairs. Rachel's heart raced as she moved toward the staircase, her stomach knotting with dread. David followed closely, his face growing tense with every step. The laughter grew louder, mingling with the faint sound of running water. As they reached the landing, Rachel's pulse pounded in her ears. The sound was coming from the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, steam escaping in wispy tendrils. Rachel hesitated, her instincts screaming that something was wrong.
"Mom," she called again, her voice louder, sharper.
Still no response. She pushed the door open. Time froze. Inside the bathroom, Helen and her grandson stood too close. Their positions, their expressions, everything about the scene, spoke volumes. The laughter abruptly stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Rachel's world shattered in that instant. The betrayal, incomprehensible and cruel, struck her like a physical blow. She stared, unable to process what she was seeing, unable to speak.
"What the hell is this?"
David's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and filled with restrained fury. Helen scrambled to cover herself, her face pale and twisted with guilt. The twins stood frozen, their bravado replaced by shame and fear.
"Rachel, I can explain."
Helen stammered, her voice trembling. But Rachel didn't want explanations. Her eyes burned with tears, her mind racing to comprehend the betrayal unraveling before her.
"Explain!"
She spat, her voice shaking with rage.
"What could you possibly say to explain this?"
The confrontation erupted like a storm. Rachel's fury poured out, directed at Helen and the boys in equal measure. She demanded answers, but the responses were weak, evasive. Helen tried to take responsibility, stumbling over apologies and excuses, but the damage was already done.
You were supposed to protect them.
Rachel screamed, her voice cracking with emotion.
You're their grandmother, for God's sake.
The twins, stripped of their usual confidence, stood like chastised children, unable to meet their mother's blazing eyes. Caleb attempted to speak, but Rachel silenced him with a glare so cold it could have frozen time.
Don't.
She hissed, her tone filled with venom.
Don't you dare.
David, who had been standing silently, clenched his fists at his sides. His jaw tightened, his fury barely contained. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone was a warning. Rachel turned her anger back to Helen.
How could you? How could you do this to us, to them, to me?
Helen's attempts to explain only deepened the wound. She spoke of loneliness, of feeling lost, of things spiraling out of control. But Rachel wasn't listening. To her, there was no justification, no excuse for what had happened.
You've destroyed this family.
Rachel said, her voice a mix of rage and sorrow.
Everything we've built, gone.
Desperate, Helen reached out, her hands trembling.
Rachel, please don't do this. We can fix this. We can move past it.
Rachel recoiled as if burned.
Fix this?
You think this can be fixed? Yeah. Her gaze turned to the twins, now hanging their heads in shame.
Get dressed, she ordered, her tone icy. We're leaving.
The boys didn't argue. They moved quickly, retreating to their rooms to gather their things. David began packing with precision, his movements mechanical, his face unreadable. Helen trailed after Rachel as she descended the stairs, pleading with her.
Please, Rachel, don't do this. I made a mistake, but I'm still your mother.
Rachel stopped abruptly at the bottom of the stairs, turning to face Helen. Her voice was calm, but her words cut deeper than any scream. You're dead to me. The weight of those words crushed Helen. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Rachel didn't look back. She walked out the door, David and the twins following behind her. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the empty house, leaving only Helen's anguished cries. As the family drove away, the silence in the car was deafening. The ties that had once bound them were now frayed beyond repair. Rachel stared out the window, her mind a storm of anger and heartbreak. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. Ethan and Caleb sat in the back, their heads bowed, their guilt palpable. For Helen, the realization of her actions settled heavily. She had lost everything, her daughter, her grandsons, her family. The house, once filled with life and laughter, now felt like a prison, and she was left alone with the consequences of a nightmare she had created. But the fallout of that night was far from over. The damage was done, and the scars would remain long after the dust settled. The fallout of that fateful night was swift and merciless. Rachel and her family left Helen's home in silence, their trust shattered, their bonds irreparably broken. The drive back to their own house was heavy with unspoken words, the tension suffocating. Rachel sat rigid in the passenger seat, her hands trembling as she gripped her knees. David, equally stunned, focused on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. In the back seat, Ethan and Caleb sat in muted shame, their heads bowed, stripped of the confidence they once carried so proudly. No one dared speak. Words couldn't capture the enormity of what had just happened. Back at home, Rachel shut herself in her room, consumed by the betrayal. Helen had been more than a mother. She was the woman who had taught her right from wrong, the matriarch who had held their family together. Now she was a stranger, someone capable of unimaginable betrayal. Rachel's mind raced with questions that seemed to have no answers. How had this happened? How had she missed the signs? Meanwhile, Helen sat alone in her now silent house, her thoughts an oppressive weight. The vibrant energy Ethan and Caleb had brought was gone, replaced by an emptiness that echoed through the rooms. She replayed the events in her mind, searching for the exact moment she had lost control, the moment she had crossed the line. But there was no singular moment. It had been a slow unraveling, a descent into something unrecognizable. The whispers in the community began soon after. Rachel, desperate for solace, confided in a close friend, but the story spread like wildfire, warping with each retelling. Helen became the target of hushed conversations and judgmental glances. Her neighbors, once kind and welcoming, now avoided her. The isolation she had once feared became her reality, an endless loop of rejection and disdain. Rachel struggled to keep her family together, but the wounds ran deep. Every time she looked at her sons, she saw their complicity in the betrayal. She wanted to forgive them. They were her children, after all, but the pain was too fresh. Ethan and Caleb, burdened by guilt, tried to apologize, but their words felt hollow. They had betrayed not only their mother, but also themselves, and the guilt gnawed at them. David, ever pragmatic, urged Rachel to seek therapy. "You need help processing this," he said one evening. But Rachel resisted, her anger and pain too raw. "How do you fix something like this?" she snapped. "How do you forgive something so disgusting?" Helen, meanwhile, fell deeper into despair. The loneliness, guilt, and ostracism became unbearable. She stopped answering the phone, stopped leaving the house. She spent her days in Roger's old armchair, staring at the empty fireplace. Memories of her husband, the life they had built, and the person she used to be haunted her. She asked herself repeatedly how she had fallen so far, how she had allowed herself to destroy everything she had once held dear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the room, Helen reached a decision. She couldn't live like this anymore. The weight of her guilt, the whispers of the community, and the pain she had caused her family had become unbearable. She wrote a letter, her hands trembling as she poured her thoughts onto the page. She apologized to Rachel, Ethan, and Caleb, acknowledging the hurt she had caused. She addressed Roger, too, expressing shame for tarnishing his memory. Helen didn't ask for forgiveness. She knew she didn't deserve it. Instead, she wrote of her hope that her family might one day heal, even if it meant doing so without her. The next morning, a neighbor noticed Helen's mail piling up and grew concerned. After knocking on the door and receiving no answer, they called the authorities. When the police arrived and entered the house, they found Helen slumped in Roger's chair, clutching the letter. She had taken her own life, unable to bear the weight of her actions. The news reached Rachel that afternoon. The call left her numb, a mix of emotions swirling inside her, anger, sadness, and a strange hollowness. As much as she had resented her mother, the finality of Helen's death hit her like a tidal wave. Sitting on the couch, the phone still in her hand, Rachel whispered to David, "She's gone. She's really gone." The family attended Helen's funeral, but it was an event devoid of warmth or closure. There were no heartfelt eulogies, no comforting anecdotes. Rachel stood by the grave, her emotions tangled in anger, sorrow, and guilt. She didn't cry. She didn't know if she even could. In the weeks that followed, Rachel tried to rebuild her life. She poured herself into work and attempted to mend her relationship with Ethan and Caleb. But the shadow of Helen's actions lingered. The twins carried the weight of their guilt, their bond with their mother forever altered. And Rachel, despite her efforts, couldn't escape the question that haunted her. Could she have prevented this? Helen's choice left an indelible scar on the family. Trust, once so deeply rooted, had been shattered. The bonds that held them together now felt tenuous, held by the faint hope that time might dull the pain. But some truths are too heavy, some wounds too deep to ever fully heal. Some stories don't end with clean resolutions. They linger, forcing us to question trust, morality, and the fragile bonds that tie us together. The tragedy of this family shows how easily those bonds can unravel when trust is shattered. Helen's story is a reminder of how loneliness can cloud judgment and how blurred boundaries can lead to devastating choices. But it also raises a question. Where does the blame truly lie? In the actions of those who betray or the silence of those who fail to resist? If this story moved you, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another gripping tale. Your support helps us bring you more thought-provoking stories. Join us next time as we uncover another tale of heartbreak, betrayal, and the hidden secrets that dwell in the shadows of family life. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, some secrets are closer than you think.